Hello, y'all. It's me. It's Dr. G. Welcome back to Star-Spangled Studies. Now, I want you to picture something. It's 1763. The British Empire is on top of the world. They had just defeated their arch rival in France, and they won the massive global conflict, possibly what we might call the First World War, the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War. In America, the colonists are celebrating. A young Philadelphian named Benjamin Rush, visiting Parliament, saw the king's throne, and he said, quote, "He felt as if he walked on sacred ground with emotions that I cannot describe," end quote. They, the colonists, were proud to be British. They were British subjects, and they felt that they enjoyed a degree of liberty that was simply unknown in the absolute monarchies of France and Spain. Fast forward just over a decade, those same colonists are at war with that same empire, declaring their independence and severing those emotional ties forever. How on earth did this happen? That's our question today. And the answer, as future President John Adams would later argue, wasn't just about battles and taxes. He wrote, and this may be one of my all-time favorite quotes, quote, "But what do we mean by the American Revolution? Do we mean the American War? The revolution was effected before the war commenced. The revolution was in the minds and hearts of the people. This radical change in principles, opinions, sentiments, and affection of the people was the real American Revolution," end quote. That was powerful stuff. But today, we're going to journey into those minds and hearts. We're going to trace the path from proud British subjects to defiant American rebels. We'll look at the imperial blunders, the powerful ideas, the riots in the streets, and the quiet revolutions happening in homes and churches across the colonies that all eventually led to the birth of these United States. So grab your tricorn hats. The story of the American Revolution begins now. So let's go. The year 1763 should have been a monument of triumph for the British Empire. The Treaty of Paris had just been signed. The 7 Years' War was over. In fact, historian Winston Churchill, who was later a British prime minister, he called this the First World War. Britain had vanquished France, its longtime enemy, and it seized vast territories in North America, including Canada and all land east of the Mississippi River. The colonists who had fought alongside the British redcoats were jubilant at this situation. Benjamin Franklin, as I had mentioned last episode, wrote to a friend in 1760 about the mood of the colonists. Quote, "No one can rejoice more sincerely than I do the reduction and the defeat of Canada, and this not merely as I am a colonist, but as I am a Briton," end quote. But victory, as it so often does, came with a massive hangover. The war, as one historian has put it, had been enormously expensive, and the British national debt had nearly doubled. Parliament back in London now faced the daunting task of governing and defending a much larger and more complex American empire. Their solution was to keep a standing army of 10,000 British troops in North America, a decision that would lead to, quote, "a variety of problems with the colonists," end quote, and cost a staggering £250,000 sterling per year. The first major policy to emerge from this new reality was the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which I had mentioned last episode. Fresh off the brutal frontier conflict known as Pontiac's War or Pontiac's Rebellion, a pan-Indian uprising against British policies, the Crown sought to avoid a more costly war with those on the frontier. To do this, it drew a line right down the spine of the Appalachian Mountains and simply forbade the colonial settlements from moving west of it. The language was stark, ordering any white settlers to remove themselves immediately. For many colonists, especially the ambitious gentry class who saw their future fortunes in the Western land speculation, this was a stunning blow. George Washington, a land speculator himself, was furious. He fumed that the proclamation was discriminatory, preventing colonists from acquiring valuable lands and paying off personal debts. In a letter to a friend, he revealed his true feelings, dismissing the king's decree as nothing more than a, quote, temporary expedient to quiet the minds of the Indians, end quote. He urged his friend to ignore it. Quote, any person, therefore, who neglects the present opportunity of hunting out good lands will never regain it, end quote. This reaction shows more than just economic frustration. It reveals a fundamental breakdown in respect for the king and imperial authority. This ideological shock was a critical turning point. Before 1763, colonists largely saw themselves as partners in a glorious British enterprise. They saw themselves as British subjects with British rights afforded to all British subjects. The Proclamation, however, treated them not as partners in this British enterprise, but as peoples to be managed and contained. It wasn't just a line on the map, it was more like a line in the sand. Historians have argued that the resentment it caused, quote, bonded Americans of varying socioeconomic backgrounds on a philosophical level, and it marked the beginning of a clear ideological break with the mother country, end quote. It planted the first seeds of a common American identity and grievance, and it was defined by that shared grievance against a distant authority that didn't understand the realities across the Atlantic. With the empire's finances in shambles, the British Parliament turned to the colonies to help pay for the war and the army now stationed there. This unleashed a flurry of legislation that colonists came to call the alphabet soup of taxation. The Sugar Act of 1764, the Currency Act of 1764, and the Townshend Acts of 1767 all aimed to regulate trade with the colonies and to raise tax revenue to pay, one, for the war, and two, for the continued soldiers that remained. But the one that truly ignited a firestorm in the colonies was the Stamp Act of 1765. This was the first direct internal tax levied on the colonists by Parliament, requiring a paid stamp on nearly all paper goods. You want to buy a newspaper? You're going to need a stamp. Do you want to get something notarized or another legal document like a will? You got to pay a stamp. Do you want to buy playing cards? Yeah, those need a stamp. It affected literally everyone. The core of the conflict wasn't just about the money to be paid, although that was a part of it. It created a profound constitutional crisis. The colonists, who saw themselves as possessing all the rights of Englishmen, rallied around a cry that we all know today: no taxation without representation. They argued that only their own elected local colonial assemblies, not some distant parliament where they had no representatives, had the right to tax them. The British government countered with a theory, and it wasn't a good one, the theory of virtual representation, claiming that the members of parliament represented the interests of all British subjects, wherever they lived. This was a fundamental and ultimately inconceivable and irreconcilable disagreement. And it really turned the head of many in the colonies about the nature of power, liberty, and the effects, or at least how far, the British Constitution went in protecting them. This growing anger wasn't just happening in the halls of colonial assemblies. It was being fueled by a revolution of ideas happening in the colonies. These ideas were being circulated in churches, in taverns, and in the pamphlets of popular press. With each new taxation, with each new setback, the seeds of revolution started to sprout. Last episode, we had talked about the Great Awakening, but the Great Awakening is only really possible with another huge movement that happens at the same time, and that's the Enlightenment. And even though the Great Awakening and the Enlightenment are seemingly at odds, the two of them together converge to create a population in the colonies uniquely primed to question authority and imagine a different future. The Great Awakening, as we talked about, was a massive transatlantic religious revival, and it swept through the colonies in the decades of the 1730s and 40s. It was emotional, it was personal, and maybe most important, it was profoundly democratic. Anybody could be a part of it. These charismatic itinerant preachers like the Englishman George Whitefield, who traveled from town to town and giving these fiery sermons to huge crowds because established churches wouldn't let him in. His message was simple. Formal religion was not enough. Simply going to church didn't fulfill nor lead you to heaven. Each individual needed to cultivate a direct as well as emotional conversion experience. They needed a new birth. Even a skeptic like Benjamin Franklin found himself captivated by Whitefield's powerful oratory. Franklin recounted attending one of his sermons, having decided to beforehand not to donate to Whitefield's cause. But as the sermon progressed, Franklin softened, first deciding to give him his copper coins, then his silver, and finally, he was so moved that he, quote, emptied my pocket wholly into the collector's dish, gold and all, end quote. While Whitefield moved hearts with passion, preachers like Jonathan Edwards of Massachusetts moved them with terror. We had talked about sinners in the hands of an angry God. In a time before electricity, these sermons had the effect of electricity, causing people to cry out in fear and to seek immediate salvation. The emphasis on individual experience challenged the authority of the established clergy, the old light, and they were seen as being uninspired and stoic and not really progressive. More importantly, as historian Mark Knoll observed, the awakening was, quote, America's first truly national event, and it created a shared cultural and religious experience that connected colonists from New England to Georgia. Running parallel to this wave of religious fervor was the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was a philosophical movement that celebrated reason, scientific inquiry, and natural rights. Many famous thinkers like John Locke argued that individuals possess inherent rights to life, liberty, and property, and that government was a contract created to protect those rights. This intellectual current fostered a deep suspicion of unchecked power, like kings. This is vividly demonstrated in the trial of John Peter Zenger in 1735 that we had talked about last episode. Nevertheless, for decades, historians have debated the real cause of the American Revolution. Was it a high-minded intellectual struggle for liberty, or was it driven by the economic and social grievances of different classes? There are different schools of thought within this, but maybe the most compelling understanding lies in the synthesis of several views. As Gary Nash puts it, quote, everyone has economic interests and everyone has an ideology, end quote. The two are not mutually exclusive. Economic grievances filled with philosophical and ideological differences about liberty and natural rights provided the language and the intellectual framework that colonists needed to articulate their very real grievances about economic and social structure. The fear of being reduced to slavery by British taxation, that's the words the colonists use. And this idea was so potent precisely because the very real institution of chattel slavery was a daily reality in their world. So the ideas of the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening gave meaning, justification, and a revolutionary power to the anger that they felt in the docks, in the workshops, and in the farms across the colonies. Ideas are powerful, but they don't start a revolution on their own. They need action. And that action came in Boston. a city simmering already with resentment, action that was about to explode onto the streets. The intellectual and religious fervor of the mid-18th century provided the tinder, but it was a series of escalating confrontations centered in the fiery port of Boston that provided the spark. A key battleground in this conflict was, surprisingly, the marketplace. The colonies had undergone a consumer revolution, becoming enthusiastic buyers of British goods like the tea, textiles, and fine mahogany furniture. This trade tied them culturally and economically to the empire, themes that we checked out last episode. But when Parliament began imposing new taxes, colonists weaponized their consumption patterns. They organized non-importation agreements. They boycotted British goods in a powerful display of collective resistance. Wearing homespun cloth instead of the fine British textiles became a political statement, a badge of virtue against what they saw as British luxury and consumption and British overreach. This economic pressure cooker was bound to explode, and it did, March 5th, 1770. Tensions between resentful Bostonians and the British soldiers quartered in their cities erupted into violence. A street confrontation escalated until panicked British redcoats fired into a crowd, killing 5 colonists. Patriots like Paul Revere and Sam Adams immediately seized on the event, branding it the Boston Massacre. Revere's famous engravings of the incident depicted organized British soldiers firing on helpless, unarmed crowd was a masterpiece of propaganda that circulated throughout the colonies, fanning the flames of anti-British resentment. But it didn't start the revolution. 3 years later, another protest sent shockwaves across the Atlantic. In 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act. It wasn't a new tax, but it actually gave the struggling British East India Company a monopoly on the American tea trade. The colonists saw this as a Trojan horse, a sneaky attempt to make them accept Parliament's right to tax them. On the night of December 16, 1773, a group of the Sons of Liberty, thinly disguised as Mohawk Indians, boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of tea into the water. This act of defiance, which became known as the Boston Tea Party, was a direct assault on British property and authority. But that didn't start the revolution. Parliament reacted, and it was swift, and boy was it punitive. In 1774, it passed a series of laws that the colonists dubbed the Intolerable Acts or the Coercive Acts. They were designed to crush Massachusetts and make an example of it for its disobedience. The most draconian was the Boston Port Act, which closed the city's harbor to all trade until the destroyed tea was paid for. It was basically an economic death sentence. But instead of isolating Massachusetts, the Intolerable Acts actually had an opposite effect. The other colonies saw the punishment of Boston as an attack on the rights of all Americans. Hey, if they can do this to Boston, they can do this to us. In a remarkable display of solidarity, other colonies sent supplies to the blockaded city. This shared threat led to the convening of the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia in 1774, where delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies met to coordinate a unified resistance. It was a momentous step towards nationhood. Yet even as war clouds are gathering, most colonists still hesitated at the final radical step of independence. That changed in January 1776 with the publication of a 47-page pamphlet that would alter the course of history, Common Sense by Thomas Paine. Paine was a recent immigrant from England, and he wrote not in the lofty language of philosophers, but in the plain, fiery language of the common person. He attacked the very idea of monarchy as absurd, and the institution of hereditary succession as an insult to reason. He famously argued, quote, "Small islands not capable of protecting themselves are the proper objects for kingdoms to take under their care. But there is something absurd in supposing a continent to be perpetually governed by an island." End quote. Paine reframed the entire conflict, elevating it from a dispute over taxes to a world historical struggle for liberty, declaring, quote, "The cause of America is a great measure the cause of all mankind." Common Sense became an instant bestseller. It sold an estimated 150,000 copies and reached hundreds of thousands of more people through public readings in taverns and in town squares. It shattered one of the final psychological barriers to independence and convinced countless Americans that the complete break with Britain was not just necessary, but a moral imperative. Paine's words turned a colonial rebellion into a revolution for a new kind of nation. The final step was to make it official. The Declaration of Independence and the brutal war that fought to make its war a reality is next. The War of Independence didn't begin with a grand declaration, but with the crack of a musket on a village green. On April 19, 1775, British troops marched from Boston to seize colonial arms stored in Concord. They were met by colonial militiamen in Lexington, and the, quote, "shot heard round the world" ignited a war. The fighting that day, which saw the British harassed all the way back to Boston by swarms of farmers and artisans, proved that this would be no easy rebellion to crush. A year later, July 4th, 1776, the Second Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence. Primarily the work of Thomas Jefferson, this document was far more than a political breakup letter. It was a profound philosophical statement and an indictment of King George III, laying out a list of grievances to justify their rebellion to the world. Its most endearing and enduring passage, of course, proclaimed a new basis of government. Quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." End quote. This language of universal rights would become the American creed, a promise the new nation would spend the next 2 centuries struggling to live up to. On paper, the fight was a colossal mismatch. The colonists were taking on the 18th century equivalent of a superpower. The life of a common soldier in the Continental Army was one of incredible hardship. We can see this in their own words. They faced brutal winters, chronic shortages of food, clothing, and pay. General Washington, sharing in their suffering at Valley Forge, constantly pleaded with Congress for support. Amidst the immense public burden, the personal toll was also heavy. In a letter to his wife Martha during the war, Washington wrote, quote, "I retain an unalterable affection for you, which neither time nor distance can change," end quote. A poignant reminder of the human cost of the conflict. So how did the Patriots win? Well, the turning point came in 1777 with the stunning American victory at the Battle of Saratoga in upstate New York. This victory was monumental because it convinced France that the American cause was not a hopeless one. Benjamin Franklin, the diplomatic genius, leveraged the victory to secure a formal alliance with Britain's old rival. The entry of France into the war transformed the conflict from a colonial rebellion into another global war. Suddenly, Britain had to defend its empire in the Caribbean, in Europe, and in India. The French provided the Americans with money, weapons, soldiers, and most crucially, a navy. That navy proved decisive. In the fall of 1781 at Yorktown, Virginia, the French fleet under Admiral de Grasse blockaded the Chesapeake Bay, cutting off any chance of escape or reinforcement for the main British army under Lord Cornwallis. Trapped in the peninsula, Cornwallis was besieged by a combined force of American and French troops led by Washington and the Comte de Rochambeau. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered. The world was, quite literally, turned upside down. The war was effectively over. The war was won, independence was secured, but the revolution was not just a war against Britain, it was a war that tore American society apart. So who truly won and who lost? Well, that's what we'll talk about next. The American Revolution was in many ways America's first civil war. The society was deeply divided. While patriots fought for independence, an estimated 20% of the colonial population remained loyalist, those faithful to the British crown. These were often the royal officials, Anglican clergymen, or merchants whose livelihood depended on the trade with the empire. They faced harassment, they had their property confiscated, and many were forced into exile, becoming refugees, many of which fled to Canada or England. Their voices offer a powerful counter narrative to the triumphant patriot story. The Loyalist writer James Chalmers, in his pamphlet Plain Truth, argued that a break with Britain would lead to chaos, claiming that for the colonies, quote, independence and slavery are synonymous terms, end quote. Governor William Franklin of New Jersey, Benjamin Franklin's own son, warned the rebels that they were choosing a road that would lead to, quote, anarchy, misery, and all the horrors of a civil war, end quote. The revolutionary fervor also stirred women to question their place in society. They had been central to the resistance during and during the war. They organized boycotts and they managed farms and businesses in the absence of men. The rhetoric of liberty was not lost on them, and the most famous expression of which came from Abigail Adams. In a letter to her husband John Adams in March of 1776, as he and the other founders were contemplating independence, she issued a powerful plea, quote, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of their husbands, end quote. Then came the famous warning, quote, if particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation, end quote. John Adams' reply was telling. He dismissed her plea, laughing off her, quote, extraordinary code of laws and joking that men knew better than to repeal their, quote, masculine systems, end quote. He refused to give up the, quote, name of masters to what he called the despotism of the petticoat. This exchange perfectly captures both the radical potential and the limits of the revolution's promise for women. A new republic was being born, but its patriarchal structure would try to remain, and it would, firmly in place. Nowhere was the revolution's hypocrisy more glaring than on the issue of slavery. The colonists cried out against being enslaved by the British and their taxes, while they themselves held hundreds of thousands of people in slavery. And this contradiction was not lost on anyone. African slaves seized the moment, using the Patriots' own revolutionary language to demand their freedom. In 1775, Virginia's royal governor, Lord Dunmore, seeing this contradiction, issued a proclamation offering freedom to any enslaved man who escaped his patriot master and joined the British cause. Thousands of enslaved people risked their lives to do so, turning the war into possibly the largest slave rebellion in American history up until that point. At the same time, thousands of black men fought for the patriot cause. Despite George Washington's initial reluctance to arm them, black soldiers like Peter Salem served with distinction from the earliest battles, including the one in Bunker Hill. And throughout the war, people, especially enslaved people, submitted petitions to colonial legislatures, brilliantly turning the language of the Declaration of Independence against their masters. A 1777 petition to the Massachusetts legislature from a great number of blacks detained in a state of slavery declared that they, quote, have in common with all other men a natural and unalienable right to that freedom, end quote. They pointedly noted that, quote, inconsistency of acting themselves the part which they condemn and oppose in others, end quote. Stop being hypocrites is what they said. So while the revolution certainly did not end slavery, it created the ideological crisis that would lead several generations later to slavery's eventual demise. The glaring contradiction between the new nation's ideals and the new nation's realities became impossible to ignore. This pressure from both black and white Americans produced the world's first large-scale anti-slavery movement. The first abolition society was founded in Philadelphia in 1775. During the war, Vermont abolished slavery outright. In 1780, Pennsylvania passed the first Gradual Abolition Act, and other northern states would soon follow. The Revolution acted as a powerful catalyst. It provided the moral and philosophical language that abolitionists would wield for the next 80 years and forced the new nation to confront the original sin and the lasting contradiction that lay at its heart. For most Native Americans, however, the Revolution was an unmitigated disaster. Caught between two imperial powers, most Native Americans, like the Iroquois Confederacy, ultimately sided with the British, whom they saw as a more distant and less land-hungry power than the American colonists. When Britain lost, their allies were abandoned at the peace negotiations and left to face the full, unrestrained expansion of the new United States. The Patriot victory was a catastrophic one for Native American peoples east of the Mississippi. So what was the American Revolution? As John Adams said, it was a change in the minds of the people. It was a constitutional crisis that became a war for independence. It was a civil war that pitted neighbors against each other. It was a moment of radical possibility for some and a moment of profound betrayal for others. In the end, the Patriots won. They had defeated the most powerful empire on earth. And as the smoke cleared, they faced a new, perhaps even more daunting challenge. They had thrown off the authority of a king and parliament. But what would they replace it with? They were no longer colonies, but 13 independent states jealous of their own power. In their first attempt at a national government, the Articles of Confederation would create a government so weak it could barely function. It led to debt, rebellion, and the terrifying prospect that their hard-won revolution might collapse into chaos. So how did they pull back from the brink? How did they create the framework for the nation we know today? Well, join me next time on Star-Spangled Studies as we dive into that turbulent 1780s. We witness Shays' Rebellion and the dramatic debates that forged the United States Constitution. I'm Dr. G. I'll see y'all in the past.